Okay, so I just wanted to start this off. This is not what I wanted to get to. I'm actually going to be talking about the Bates powwow because they've got a lot of their stuff posted online so that you can go watch it. So I'm going to play a couple of clips from the Bates powwow because, I want people to be interested, but I also want you to know what's in it. They did what I suspected when they were doing for like the hand drum competition. They had people sending in videos. They did something very similar with the actual powwow and the grand entry. They played some clips from previous grand entries that they've had when they could all gather in person, and then they had individuals who had videos for the opening blessing and talking about some of the ceremonial items that they were going to be using. And then the people who were emceeing had their own setups with a green screen behind them. And they did ASL interpreting, which I was very glad to see. So they had a pretty good setup. They had a couple of technical difficulties, which, that happens. Oh, if Crank's at work, then I won't bother. Continue working and we'll just talk about you. Okay, but first, and this is a thing that I don't think gets as much discussion as it should. Actually, let me hold on. I think I have a thing. Ha! It worked. Look at that. Frequently, I think when we get discussions of things like mascots, like team mascots, it really gets boiled down to what is the popular opinion on the subject. So they'll do things like, well, in a survey of 1,000 people, only one guy gave a crap about Native American mascots. So really, we don't have to care about that. It's not a big deal. And then someone in the background at some point will start talking about, systemic racism and cultural bias and things like that. But I don't think most people actually have a really good sense of what we mean when we discuss things like systemic racism or cultural bias or subtext. And even when we talk about things like microaggressions, I actually heard, I think was it Dennis Prager, made famous by Prager University, had said something like microaggressions are ridiculous because if it's that small, then it can't possibly be that important. And it's like that's not what a microaggression means. Micro means that it's a small aggression, not that the thing that's underlying it is small. Overt racism and sexism is not a tiny issue. It's just this was a moment of it happening. So I wanted to point out a very specific moment that stood out to me. So, because I think it represents a much larger issue, and I don't think it gets talked about as much as it really should. Now, for those of you who've known me in any of the other chats and spaces and who've seen any of my videos, you know that I'm kind of left-leaning when it comes policy-wise. But that doesn't necessarily imply that I'm all that concerned with race and race-related issues. You'll notice that I tend to game native and native adjacent games. I tend to talk about native and native adjacent issues, but the implication there is that I'm mostly talking about it because I'm in some way tied to an indigenous community, and that's why it's relevant to me. The reality is, part of the reason that this is as relevant to me as it is the social science background that I have. One of my favorite professor friends, she teaches sociology, but she passed me a meme one morning and it kind of made my day. But it was, I think, a Tumblr post, and it was, "Dear spouses of social science majors, if we don't talk during the movie, how will you know why we threw our shoe at the television?" And that's really what it amounts to. It's like once you start seeing these gears and mechanisms operating on a daily basis and are able to articulate it because you now have the jargon to do so, it's really hard to not spot it all over the place. And you kind of have to suppress the urge to bring it up very often. mainly because most of the people around you don't really want to hear it. But I think in this space, at least kind of a curated audience, y'all are prepared for some of these weightier themes on this particular topic, and you don't mind if I focus in a little bit and maybe throw my shoe at a few things. Yeah, exactly. Microaggression is just it's a small pocket of a much larger issue, some form of bigotry or bias that happened during a conversation instead of happening in, a stadium. So the micro is in the interaction that was occurring, not in the type of aggression that was demonstrated. But actually, yeah, that's a really good example, Ink. And one of the things that sort of tying this back to leftist conversations, right around the same time that Kropotkin was writing Mutual Aid and some little moments of foundational critical race theory were coming out of the, German schools, there was an author that some of you may have heard of. He was black, and his name is W.E.B. Du Bois. And what he wrote was a text called The Souls of Black Folk. Came out in 1905. And in it, sort of in answer to Karl Marx and his idea of false consciousness, and this is getting into a little bit of theory, but I'm not going to pick it apart too deep. If you really want to know more about it, honest to God, the Wikipedia page is perfectly good for this. False consciousness was basically Karl Marx arguing, and then the sociologist Max Weber took this idea and ran with it. It was Marx arguing that you convince yourself that you're okay with your station in life, that class consciousness, becoming aware of the fact that there are people who are in control of your life, that you will never affect their decisions, that becoming class conscious, the condition that you were in before that was false consciousness. You thought that you were making choices. You thought that you had control over your own life in some way, but you were actually wrong about that. The decisions were being made in boardrooms well removed from your daily experience that you will never be sitting in. I don't disagree with his premise, but the one thing that Marx never really addressed was, even if you're aware of your class, there are other intersecting issues that would still prevent you from having any kind of authority or from having a valid perspective on certain issues. We can go all the way back to 1848 and the Seneca Falls Convention, when Sojourner Truth stood up in a room full of white women who were talking about suffrage. And this was first wave feminism. They were saying things like, why does a man have to hold the door open for me? I'm a strong woman. I can hold the door open for myself. And this was a pearl clutching, gasp inducing statement. How dare a woman say that she's not one of the weaker sex? And Sojourner Truth, who'd been a slave her entire life, stood up and said in front of this congregation of people, okay, hold on a second. I've never once had a man hold a door open for me, ever. And you're saying that this is a defining characteristic of the weaker sex. You literally just said, I'm not female. So what am I? And then this became immortalized as the ain't I a woman speech. Well, Du Bois was making the same point in The Souls of Black Folk. He's like, all of this dialogue that is happening on class and income and the bourgeoisie and all that. Black people exist, right? We've been the slave class, so we have a completely different and unrelated narrative to whatever the crap these college boys are sitting around debating in smoking lounges on a Thursday. So that's what The Souls of Black Folk is really talking about. And instead of talking about false consciousness, as Marx had, he talked about double consciousness. He said, I have to be aware at all times. Not only am I part of the lower classes, not only am I part of the proletariat, I'm a black proletariat. You should see how you white proletariats treat us black proletariats, even though you keep claiming we're all in the same struggle. Everyone following along with me so far? Throw all the shoes I need. Really, I want to make sure that everybody's up to speed on what double consciousness is meant to represent overall. I don't know. Why can't you delete your own comment? Because Twitch is rude. That is my claim. Okay, we're up to speed so far. And yes, Jodki, this is sort of the like origin of intersectional analysis. But believe me, Souls of Black Folk, intersectional analysis was still in its infancy. A lot of Marxists and communists and real radical lefties for the period didn't want to hear this. They did not want to have that conversation. That even when the white prole still had authority and power and were, we had unions going on and people were forming into syndicalists were coming out of the woodwork and being suppressed by the Pinkertons and such. And they were already distancing themselves from black workers. They were distancing themselves from, black sharecroppers. And it's like, no, we're in the same battle, guys. Just because I got freed from my slavery doesn't mean that I'm not in debt servitude for the rest of my life. So why aren't you talking to us as well? And you can even see that kind of civilized versus agrarian divide. We talk about white farmers constantly and how they're an oppressed category. Let's talk about black farmers for a second. Let's talk about indigenous farmers who are trying to reclaim land that was stolen through treaty violation. Why doesn't that ever come up when they interview these white farmers who are suffering? Isn't that weird? So this conversational distance between these two issues has been around and been talked about for a long time. And then I've noticed lefty discourse just has kind of left it behind. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to bring up. No, there's still other issues present in lefty discourse. And there's other discussions that need to be had beyond, let's foment the coming revolution. Okay, that's great. But that's just going to put a different group of white people in charge of minority concerns and interests. BLM wasn't supported by every lefty I know. This is a thing. And the reason that I wanted to give that really brief introduction to double consciousness and what it's like to be in a minority within a minority class is because unless you've read Du Bois, you really don't necessarily have the vocabulary to articulate what it is that you're seeing. You just get mad. It's like, and then you almost get stuck in this perpetually angry black woman, perpetually angry white man or native man, but you don't have the words to express what the anger is. I would like, in my own brief way, to provide you an insight into why that anger exists in a way that I think is palatable and also in a way that will demonstrate how pervasive some of these concepts really can be. Well, exactly. And that was Du Bois's ultimate point, was if we're having a conversation about freeing the proletariat, and we haven't even really defined what the proletariat is beyond income class, okay, then we're not really talking about the right subjects. And this is where we get into class reductionism really is bigoted. It is avoiding a conversation that needs to be had. So all of this is floating around in my head. And, I've got to release the demon from inside and throw a shoe. All of this is floating around in my head. And I'm watching Jose, who is, he's a YouTuber. he's funny. He has some really interesting insights. He does sort of entertainment analysis. So he's got a video on, honest to God, the reason I started following him in the first place was because he covered several of the shows that I used to watch when I was younger. And his sort of approach was, whatever happened to this show? And so he talks about Murphy Brown. I think he has one on designing women. He has one on home improvement and Malcolm in the Middle. And he does this really in-depth, detailed discussion of what these shows were, what they talked about, where are they now? It's roughly the same thing. There's several YouTubers that I follow for roughly the same reason. Like there was one that I followed specifically because she did an episode on Hey Dude, the show Hey Dude. And I'm like, no one has heard of this show. I must follow this person and hopefully hang out with them and talk about shitty old television shows at some point. Yes, this has to do with why you're staring at a room full of white men in tuxes. So, that double consciousness thing. Jose didn't mention this. In the entire stream of him talking about what was going on, he doesn't bring this up, even though he does talk about some of the artificiality of the people in this room. And it struck me how invisible this sort of bigotry can be to a person who isn't cued in to what's going on. You're looking at this room full of people in tuxes, and what they are discussing is I believe we could very generously call it a form of right-leaning journalism called the Daily Wire. And the reason that the Daily Wire is well known at all is because Ben Shapiro is the primary author and editor for this. And he churns out articles for it, like 5 or 6 a day. And it's basically the way that he speaks, only in written form. So it's these choppy sentences that barely allude to anything that's informative, really aggressive argumentation on nonsense points. He's trying to build his own little media empire. Well, they have a lot of advertisers, so they have a fair amount of money to throw around. And what the Daily Wire did recently is they underwrote a movie, which is called Run, Hide, Fight. Or, as several critics have sort of summarized it, Die Hard at a high school. The premise of this movie is disgusting. There's a group of, we'll call them terrorist insurgents, but they are fellow students at the school who basically go on a shooting rampage. And actually, Momo, if you wouldn't mind putting a content warning on this. Yeah, already hate it. I'm not going to get into the heavier side of this conversation because I'm not interested in having the heavier side of this conversation. But I was in a school that had a school shooting, so I don't want to touch this either. I'm only giving you what the movie is about so that you have some vague idea of what the crap is happening as we see. So this movie, essentially one of the students, I guess you would say, fights back. And that's the premise of the film. Like, wouldn't it be great? Ultimately, if you're looking for the subtext of this film, wouldn't it be great if every 17-year-old was armed, is really the point of this film. It's total bullshit from beginning to end. And it's badly written. The acting is mediocre, but the plot is nonsense. The whole thing is trash. But they had a little premiere party. Of course they did. Because it's the first film that the Daily Wire has underwritten, and they're like trying to become the next Fox Studios or something. I don't frickin' know. Maybe they want to become a film production company or start a film production company. I have no idea. And the reason that I'm surprised that it didn't stand out to Jose when he was talking about this premiere party that they were having and these weird conversations that they were bringing up was because he spotlights each of the people that you're looking at currently and talks about what horrible people they are. I mean, Shapiro, there's plenty of back catalog there to base on, but the rest of them you have to kind of look up to know who they are and why they're relevant and why they're trash. Agreed. And believe me, I'm not in any way saying that I'm okay with this film existing. I'm not. But that's not even what's happening in this shot. So if you look at the scene setting, you'll notice they've got popcorn in front of them, which none of them ever eats, and a popcorn maker off on the right, right? Makes perfect sense. If you kind of look at there's a little bit of dithering happening to the backstage premiere night banner that's in the back. So I don't even know why, but they have a large screen TV. They were not projecting that image. They superimposed it on the image later. You can see some digital artifacting on the left-hand corner because the left-hand corner of the television is out of focus, but the left-hand corner of the screen is not out of focus. So that's a digital overlay. I don't know why you would do that. So, understand that that's the level of complete artifice that is happening on this stage. And they've got a little poster off on the left side. That's the poster for the film Run, Hide, Fight. They've got a couple of drinks in front of them on the table that none of them really ever drinks. And by the way, notice that there's, this is how artificial this whole thing is. Notice on the right between Shapiro and the bald guy, there's a drink with a straw in it, but there's no ice. So that drink has just been sitting there under those stage lights, thawing, with no one having ever drunk it. Literally everything about this stage setting is completely fake. Hey, Della, how you doing? We're going over, I'm going over, ranting a bit, about embedded microaggressions and how they're not as micro as a lot of people seem to think. Okay, so even the shape of the table, it tapers toward downstage front. Everything about this thing is, we are in a fake room set up for this purpose. Now look off on the left. There's like a dime store cigar Indian, only they're holding a clapboard. Isn't that witty? But if you look at the artifice of the rest of this stage setting, that means that this was completely intentional. It was put in there, nothing to do with this film, nothing to do with anything that they're talking about at all. It was just put in there, and it's behind a velvet rope. This was the thing they paid a lot of attention to. And if you look, I'm going to mute this so that I don't get like a copyright strike. But if you notice, there's even lighting going on. Like they're calling attention to this dime store cigar Indian statue for no freaking reason. It's just there. So I've actually got you'll notice I've got queued up way into this video because I first caught it. They were profiling this guy and talking about what he was saying. And so this little, like the arm of this statue was behind him when they were talking about him. And I'm like, is that a dime store cigar Indian? What the crap do they have that in there for? Has nothing to do with the film. The film does not involve any natives doing anything. I mean, there may be some vaguely indigenous related character in the movie. It's not like I've seen it, so I wouldn't know. But here's where it gets really interesting. So I want to go over what these dime store Indians look like. They're actually called cigar store Indians. Oh, thank you, Lilith. That was incredibly sweet. Or anarchist, sorry. Thank you for gifting the tier 2, Lilith. So for those of you who don't know, here's what a dime store cigar statue Indian looks like. They used to carve them out of wood. And I don't know if y'all knew, but tobacco is from the Americas. So in order to advertise tobacconists, and this is like 1800s, late 17 into early 1800s, and then it carried on as a tradition way longer than it should have. It's basically from the same period as lawn jockeys, and I think y'all know how freaking racist those are. Well, that's what these were. They were Indians holding a box of tobacco and some cigars. And they were all over the place and all kinds of variations. And you'll notice, like most people who are aware of this style of artwork, they are not in any way unaware of the racist connotations. So here's this auction house that's auctioning off cigar store props and mascots. And I mean, look at, we've got Sambo, we've got the Yellow Peril, we've got all of these horrible racist tropes. And then right there is this cigar store Indian holding up, saying in that, hand gesture, how, and holding cigars. This is not an unknown phenomenon. And then we've got this fucking dime store Indian in the background of this film. What the hell is happening? Wait for it. Then we get to this shot. And see, you'll notice it just changed to premiere mode and it's out of... Okay. That's not a dime store Indian. Look at the face. It's wearing glasses. It's got a headband. And it's wearing a power suit. Okay. During the 2016 presidential primaries, Elizabeth Warren ran on the Democratic ticket. She was trying to get in for the nomination. Elizabeth Warren has a kind of troubled past with her quasi-indigenous heritage, and it goes like this. She heard from family lore for the longest time that their family was native of some kind, probably Cherokee. Lots of people have this story. And really, I'm not going to fault... I know a few of you in the room are already throwing shoes at me. I get it. Bear with me for a second. I don't fault anyone for having a family origin story that turns out to not be true. Everybody has one. Most people have several. There's always that one uncle that nobody talks about, or whatever. So it's not shocking to me that she had this idea that she had an indigenous heritage of some sort, and she wasn't really clear on all of the details. That's fine. What I do fault her for is she tried to kind of capitalize on that as like adding to her minority status and adding to her level of cultural awareness, when she really didn't do any activity that would relate her to the community that she said she was tied to genetically, which means she was compounding this idea that race is about blood and not about culture, which is a big problem. And then she made a really, really stupid mistake and just went full bore into that narrative by taking a DNA test to find out what her Indian heritage was. And there have been genealogists, there have been tribal historians who have been saying for years that Pocahontas' family, that Warren's, you'll understand why I made that slip just now, that Warren's ties to an indigenous community were not verifiable. But she went ahead and took a DNA test for some ungodly reason. And even the DNA test said, you are not related to any indigenous community that we know of genetically. The genealogists jumped on this and said, listen, not only have you been feeding this bizarre mythological narrative of your past and doing nothing about it or with it, but now you're literally reinforcing blood quanta. You are literally claiming that we are a race of creatures. This is bullshit. So she got called out for that by the indigenous community. And during the presidential campaigns, Trump pounced on it instantly and started calling her Pocahontas. Yeah, that's exactly, Della. She was using it for clout. She wasn't using it to represent a community. And all of these indigenous scholars were saying exactly that. And then she took the DNA test and everybody really lost their shit. And then the DNA test turned out to not show anything that any of these genealogists had already said. Trump lost his mind. He thought it was the funniest thing ever. And so he started calling her Pocahontas. Now, I hope I don't have to explain in great detail how insanely racist that is, because the Powhatan Confederacy is not even vaguely related to the Cherokee that Warren was claiming she was a part of. And by the way, on top of that, you wouldn't be related to Pocahontas anyway. And on top of that, Pocahontas is not the woman's name. Pocahontas is a nickname that kids would get in the Powhatan Confederacy. It vaguely translates to little brat or little mischief maker. So this was a nickname that she had. Oh, and by the way, her entire fucking story was written down by a racist named Smith, who claimed that they fell in love with each other when she was 12 years old. There's nothing good about calling a white woman Pocahontas as a nickname. That's just a slur. Flat the fuck out. Then Warren's campaign finance report came out, and it got turned into Brocahontas. Because if there's one thing that racists love to do, it's double down on a slur that they know has already been offensive. Okay, so are we all up to speed on this? From Dime Store Cigar Indian to Elizabeth Warren to Pocahontas to Brocahontas. And now, in a movie premiere debut interview, they have a statue of this Brocahontas with the clapboard for their film. That level of sheer, compounded, militantly bigoted representation, that's a microaggression. So it's not a small thing. And if someone were doing a class reductionist conversation on this film, which is roughly what Jose is doing, he's talking about how this represents a political divide between the goals and the ideals of the left versus the goals and ideals of the right as represented in a form of media. And he completely missed this gigantic, glaring, racist caricature that is in a clean shot. And it's not like it's only there for a quarter of a second. It's standing behind these guys the whole time. And he doesn't say a word about it. So I just wanted to throw that out there for the next time that any of you are caught in a conversation where someone tries to argue, and you think possibly even persuasively, that, you know, class consciousness is more important than intersectionality and being aware of minorities and racism that exists even in lefty spaces. Just think about this. Think about this dime store cigar Indian, already a racist trope. Then Elizabeth Warren, another racist trope. Then Pocahontas, another racist trope. And then a film that came out 4 years after the presidential campaigns, long after this Brocahontas thing was dead, having nothing to do with any of those subjects. And yet they had to have it in their shot for no fucking reason, except to, like, I mean, this is a literal dog whistle. For those people who are not up to speed on what Elizabeth Warren was doing and how it went and all of that crap during her campaign, you would have no idea why this joke was there. None at all. This isn't even a Pepe reference. At least people get Pepe references. This is obscure. This is an actual dog whistle. This is why lefties need to pay more attention to intersectional analysis, because otherwise you miss this crap. And this is the kind of shit that is floating around for your average minority representative on the left daily. Like, literally, we can't turn on the television without seeing this shit. So, I wanted to throw that out there. In order to make this point, let me clear out some of this so that it isn't all over my screens. Here's the thing. Mascots. Like sport mascots. Remember, I let in with that. We interviewed 1,000 people. 5 guys gave a crap about this. Therefore, not a big deal. I've even seen some people on the left say we need to focus on bigger issues and not so much on things like sports mascots. Well, when you're in a stadium full of people all doing the tomahawk chop, I think it might be a bigger deal than we let on. So here's the thing that happened. This is Googie architecture. Googie came around 1940s, 1950s. It was really popular. All of you have seen some of these landmarks. You know, here's the airport in, I believe it's, what is it, San Francisco? Either San Francisco or LA, I always forget. Here is the Space Needle. There's, I mean, it's a pretty recognizable style. These weird angles and, you know, sweeping lines that come into a point. And of course, the Las Vegas sign. That is hardcore Googie architecture right there. Yeah, if we can't have this, we'll alienate the whites. More on that in a moment. But you'll notice Googie architecture is also the type of architecture that was in the Jetsons. So this was a really, really popular architectural style. Even if it's not common, it's very popular. Mostly because it's really eye gouging. Personally, I love Googie. I think it's hilarious. I think everything about it is fantastic. This is over the top in all of the best possible ways. Well, you'll notice that Googie architecture is actually really closely related to Art Deco architecture. It has some similar themes, it has some similar stylistic choices, and Art Deco is all over the place. Art Deco, 1920s, Googie, 1950s. Pretty easy transition to see. You know, you'll even notice straight lines into flowing lines, geometric into a little bit of finery at the top. It's all right there. There was a movement called Pueblo Art Deco. And Pueblo Art Deco, I'm not necessarily saying that it's racist, but it was a style. Came up around the same time as the standard Art Deco movement, moving into the 30s and 40s. Another really common representation of this style of architecture and the things that led into it were the plains style of architecture, which were done by things like a man named Wright, who was a very popular architect. He did an entire house called Falling Water, which is a very nice house, but he had a lot of these same stylistic choices. Anyway, oh, and by the way, another idea about, no, the swastika is not just a racist symbol. It was quite common all over the world, many hundreds of years, but not the point I'm trying to make here. It was present in architecture all over the place. This was a common architectural trope, just like Art Deco, just like Googie. And one of the ways that you can see that style represented is in the Fallout universe. The Fallout universe relies in its architectural designs on Googie, Art Deco, and Pueblo Deco. They're all over the place. That's what their buildings look like. That's, you know, I mean, look at this shit. It's Googie. It's right there. And it's Art Deco. Probably one of the better representations is these heads that show up all over the place, which has even transmitted into Fallout 76 as being a reference to some ancient cult, and we're not sure exactly why. Yeah, well, they got that from Art Deco. See? They were all over the place. And you'll notice they look a little bit like those dime store tobacco Indians. Isn't that weird? So another way that it fed into this style. And that kind of crap is all over the place. Here's a really good one. This is a high school in Wichita, Kansas, random freaking location. And it's covered in Pueblo Art Deco. Like, all over the place. The whole building is Pueblo Art Deco. Well, guess what the team mascot is? Yeah, subtle. So when we're talking about representation in things like mascots, when we're talking about representation in things like art and community, and someone tries to do a class reduction discussion, stop them, because these are not merely side issues that are distracting from the more important stuff. This is the important stuff. This is what people with shit tons of money do to all of the minorities that are around them. They turn them into a commodity. And that double consciousness is what allows you to see it more clearly, so that you can start to notice oh, I'm doing a class analysis on this film, and I'm totally ignoring the fact that there is a dime store cigar Indian Warren Hontus in the background the entire time. Hey, Mustard, how you doing? Welcome to the middle of a reasonably heavy discussion, but I'll get past it in just a second. Now, bear with me for a moment as I catch up on chat. I've not been ignoring you, I swear. Oh, yeah, okay. So I will now respond to several things that came up as I was talking. Sorry. Yes, one of the reasons that Warren said that this must be true is because of high cheekbones. You'll hear people say that constantly. Oh, he's got high cheekbones. He must be native. It's like, okay, please don't do that. Please do not skull type people. That's bad. That is bad praxis. And hello, Rabbit. Welcome to the Rabbit stream. What else we got here? Zombie, why did you need a Band-Aid? Are you okay? Well, okay, yeah. There's a little question on how old Pocahontas was. I know I keep saying Pocahontas, and that's not her name. By the way, this is totally an aside. We'll go ahead and get into this. So here's this woman who's from the Powhatan Confederacy. Her father was actually one of the chieftains. Her tribal name was Matoka or Mataoka. I don't speak Powhatan, so I may be mangling that a bit. I have some friends who are Powhatan. They can say it much better than I can, but my mouth does not produce the correct noises. That being said, her name was changed to Elizabeth when she transported over to England. There is a great deal of not only controversy, but also bullshit surrounding how it was that she ended up in England and married to a fat businessman named John Rolfe. She never, as far as we know, she never had any relationship with John Smith at all, apart from thinking he was interesting, this weird-looking adult guy who's the wrong color of skin because everybody else around her entire life had been brown, and now suddenly here's this pale white guy who speaks a funny-ass language, which you're a kid. Of course that's going to stand out to you. So why Smith even tried to sell this as they had a deep and abiding friendship. What are you talking about? Why aren't you talking about the chief that you were supposedly friends with? What's this obsession with her daughter? But anyway, we have a rough estimate of what her age was based on how old she thought she was when she changed her name to Elizabeth over in England. And she, at the time that she died, was around the age of 21. So doing the math backwards, best guess is that she was 11 or 12 years old when John Smith would have met her. We don't know that that's completely true. She may have been as young as 9. But for purposes of like giving people a general sense of what age we're talking about, 9 to 12, roughly, it's a sort of a span of time that's relative enough to each other year-wise. Like there's not that much difference between 9 and 10 or 10 and 11. So we tend to say she was 11 or 12. Best guess. But I mean, it's still calling attention to the fact that this guy was in his, 25 at the time, and he's waxing this romantic about a 12-year-old. So sketchy, to say the least. You're dressing up your dog? Yeah, ugly paintings. That's really so many lefties, even as far back as, the Communist Manifesto, so many lefties were minorities. You know, Ain't I a Woman? I always call attention to the Ain't I a Woman speech because it came out the same year as the Communist Manifesto. And we never hear about Sojourner Truth. We always hear about Karl Marx and class consciousness. Here is this woman who's in her 60s, which for a woman who was a former slave is impressive on its own. She's freed. She then goes back into slave territory, becomes not only a conductor on the Underground Railroad, but buys back several of the children that she was forced to have while she was still a slave in order for her family to be freed. And then she's sitting in a room full of white women complaining about people holding doors open for them. I'd much rather hear more from her than I would from Karl Marx sitting in a leatherback chair telling me what he thinks the world should be like. I'm like, no, she was actually on the front lines. You, Beardy, you talk later. She comes first. Oh, the Jets. Yeah. Yeah. One of the better sort of popular interpretations of Googie architecture is the Sonic drive-up restaurants. They kind of took a Googie light approach. Dallas Fair Park? You've intrigued me, Ink. What is Dallas Fair Park? I wish to see this now. Show me the thing. Oh dear. Oh dear. Oh, that's a lot. Wow. Are we staying Pog? Well, I hope we are, Delve. Yeah, not only Disney, but there was another movie that came out. Okay, this is a weird little tangent. Trekkie and I tomorrow are going to be talking about. There's a YouTuber. I've watched a lot of his stuff. He usually has pretty good content. He talks about the Civil War. He talks about the Civil War from the Confederate side, but he's not pro-Confederate. So, you know, wrap your brain around that first of all. But what he likes to talk about is here's the reasons the Confederacy said that they left. By the way, A, all about slaves. By the way, B, all of you pro-Confederate people, shut up. You know, so he does it, you know, it comes across when you first start listening to him as very pro-Confederate, pro-South. And then he sort of twists the conversation into stop being trash. So I like his stuff most of the time. But he also talks about historical movies occasionally. And one of the historical movies that he talked about, which I thought was great, was a movie called Ravenous, which is about these basically white soldiers who end up turning into cannibals. And there's one native character in it who literally starts referring to all of the white people as Wendigos and basically calling them demons. And the entire film is structured around the idea that manifest destiny is cannibalism. It's eating all of these indigenous populations. It is consuming them. And so I really like the film, and he talks about that at length. And I had forgotten I'd seen the movie until I watched him talking about it. But anyway, so he usually has a pretty pro-information, pro-fact-based analysis. And I know that that's a cliche, but he likes to put out names and dates and locations. And, you know, everybody thinks that Stonewall Jackson was so freaking important. And actually he was, you know, shot in the first 5 minutes and blah, 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 blah. So when I say fact-based analysis, he really is. No, that guy died on this date. He couldn't possibly have been at this battle. And he does the same thing when he's analyzing films, except he talked about a movie that discussed John Smith. And he just kind of, like, he mentions in passing, oh, by the way, Pocahontas was 12 at the time. And he mentions in passing, oh, by the way, she ended up marrying John Rolfe and, wrote her own autobiography. And half of this movie is total gibberish nonsense and racist as fuck, because the entire premise of the movie is their love story. There's like whole scenes where they cavort in the forest, making out and slowly getting naked together. And I'm like, wait, you're barely mentioning that this girl would have been 12 at the time? You really should have paid more attention to that fact. I don't understand why you're not pointing that out more forcefully. So, yeah, Trekkie and I are going to kind of break down, because the video itself is not overly long, so we can make some notes without it going to, 3 or 4 hours. But we're going to be talking about, dude, your takes are usually pretty good. What the hell happened with this? Oh, did I thought I said they. My apologies. That's my fault. Hey, Softy. Yeah, feel free to lurk. But wow, I did not expect this park to be that over the top. I've been to Dallas. I have not been to this park. That is aggressive. Woof. But yeah, you get a sense of just how embedded these racist caricatures really are. By the way, remember that Cigar Indian, and there she is. Except, of course, in this case, it's Athena or whatever, or Nike. By the way, Nike is actually a deity in the Greek pantheon. Um, so yeah, these themes repeat. And if we're not talking about these themes openly and repeatedly, then they end up just getting either compounded or ignored. And that's really what I saw in this video. Was here's Jose doing a really good analysis, talking about how artificial this all is, how completely bullshit this all is, and how is Jose not noticing this, Brocahontas? I hate saying that word, but how is he not noticing this dime store Indian sitting right behind those guys the whole time, completely out of context, totally devoid of any purpose, except to dog whistle to Shapiro's audience about a campaign that's been over with for 4 years and someone who lost. How freaking petty do you have to be? I have my own misgivings about Shapiro. I'm not going to go off on that tangent. And by the way, I also still love Googie architecture. I love Art Deco. I even like Pueblo Deco. I think it's great. There's some really good modern native jewelry and beadwork that has come out that is based on the Pueblo Deco style, and I have no problem with that. They saw an art style that was popular with white people, and they kind of did artwork to match. I have no trouble. So anyway, I wanted to bring up that as an answer to why class reductionism is a bad thing. It's not merely because we're not being inclusive enough. It's not merely because it doesn't address enough problems. It's because it's ignoring and in many cases making invisible really important and ongoing struggles of entire categories of people for the sake of claiming that class awareness is more important. And that's coming close to a pretty bigoted take. Nature calls. Does it? Well, okay. What is the point of Fair Park? Like, why does it exist? I'm now completely intrigued. And I love by the way, I adore these heads in Fallout. I like the whole Cult of Cthulhu being like vaguely involved at some points in the narrative for no seeming reason except that I guess one of the writers was a fan, and so these heads keep popping up and all. I think that's fantastic because really, as much as I adore Art Deco just as a style, those heads are creepy AF. Let's be real. And so I like the fact that they've included these heads and have just sort of removed the bodies that would make them look slightly more architecturally important, so that now it's just a head staring at you. And it's like, okay, yeah, without the rest of the over the top Art Deco context, this art style is really creepy. Oh God, that's where Big Tex is? That the state fair is there? Whoa. Oh no, no. Okay. For those of you in the audience, if you're not familiar with the Texas State Fair, you need to see this. That's Big Tex. It's so bad. And by the way, the statue is like steam driven. I don't even know how old the bloody thing is. It's many decades, but it's this. There's a tiny little compact room directly under Big Tex's feet, and they literally have pipes with valves, and that's how you control his mouth. And then someone stands there with an old style microphone and makes him talk, and his head swivels, and it's just the creepiest thing ever. The current one is hydraulic. Yeah, Big Tex is a thing. Why does it? Oh, look, they put a mask on Big Tex for COVID. Well, isn't that aware? Okay, if the old one burned down, then, okay, my information is a couple of years out of date. But the original statue, which is in many of these pictures, was this steam-driven monstrosity that his mouth moves like a ventriloquist dummy, and then he makes announcements, and it's things like, find the fried I don't know, what the hell do they eat at the Texas Big Fat? The fried cheesecake. The fried cheesecake will be at the Butter Pavilion for the next 5 minutes. And it's so bad. Oh, I loved cursed images. Bring it on. Let me see this. Oh, that's bad. Oh, I wonder if that's in the image files here. That'd be good. No, they're being way too friendly. All right, well, let's try that. Oh, that is satisfying. Wow.